There's a coin sitting in the Maine State Museum that should not exist. It is a small piece of silver, badly corroded, less than an inch wide. On one side, if you look closely, you can make out a faint cross. On the other side, the ghostly image of an animal, worn almost smooth by time. It was minted in Norway between 1065 and 1080 AD during the reign of King Olaf III, and it was found buried in the mud of Penobscot Bay, Maine, 500 miles south of the only confirmed Viking settlement in North America, where no Norse artifact should ever be. The Vikings never established a settlement in Maine. There are no Norse building foundations here, no iron ship rivets, no smithies, no worked wood with Scandinavian tool marks. In more than 70 years of archaeological excavation at the site where this coin was found, not a single other Norse artifact has ever been discovered. Just this one coin, in the hands of Maine's Native Americans, 1,000 years ago. The question that has haunted archaeologists since 1978 is simple. Why? Why did indigenous people living on the coast of Maine possess a Norwegian coin from the 11th century? How did it travel 500 miles from Newfoundland, crossing territorial boundaries, passing through countless communities, to end up buried in a Native American settlement that thrived between 1180 and 1235 AD? Three theories have emerged. One claims it is a hoax, that the coin was planted in the 1950s as an elaborate fraud. Another argues that Vikings sailed to Maine and traded directly with indigenous peoples, leaving the coin behind as proof of their presence. The third suggests something far more remarkable, that the coin traveled not on a Viking ship, but through Native American trade networks so extensive and sophisticated that they could move an exotic object 500 miles from its point of entry, hand to hand, community to community, across half the northeastern seaboard. For decades, the evidence has been analyzed, debated, and re-examined. Authentication tests, chemical analysis, archaeological surveys, historical research into Norse exploration and indigenous trade routes, and now, with new studies published as recently as September 2024, proving that Norse and indigenous peoples did trade in the Arctic, we can finally answer the question, but the answer is not what you would expect. Because this coin's journey does not tell us how far south the Vikings sailed. It tells us something far more important about the people who are already here. Before we examine the evidence and reveal which theory holds up, where in the world are you watching from right now and what time is it there? Leave a comment with your answer. I love seeing how far lost evidence reaches across the globe, and if you are fascinated by how a Norse coin traveled 500 miles through indigenous trade routes, hit like. It helps bring these stories to more people who want to know the truth about pre-Columbian Americas. To understand why this coin matters, we need to go back to the summer of 1957. Guy Melgren was crouched at the edge of a muddy embankment on the shores of Penobscot Bay, sifting through soil with the methodical patience of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. He was an amateur archaeologist, but his work was anything but amateur. For years he had been systematically excavating what would later be known as the Goddard site, a shell midden where indigenous peoples had lived for centuries. He had already recovered thousands of artifacts from this terrace above the high tide line. Stone tools shaped with precision, fire-cracked rocks from ancient hearths, animal bones from meals eaten hundreds of years ago, shells by the thousands, the discarded remains of shellfish harvests that had sustained generations of Native Americans. Every artifact told a story about the people who had lived here, their technology, their diet, their daily lives. Melgren had learned to read these stories in the objects he pulled from the mud, but on this particular day, his fingers brushed against something that did not fit the pattern. It was small, metallic, circular. He wiped away the mud and found himself holding a coin, badly corroded, less than an inch wide, part of it already crumbled to dust. On one side, he could make out a faint cross. On the other, what looked like an animal, its features worn, almost smooth by centuries in the acidic coastal soil. Melgren marked it on his excavation map with a simple notation, C for coin. Then he continued digging. He was not a numismatist. His focus was on the Native American community that had thrived at this location. A single corroded coin was interesting, but hardly seemed significant compared to the 30,000 artifacts that would eventually be recovered from the site. The coin sat in his collection for 20 years. When a friend who collected medieval currency examined it in the 1970s, the identification seemed straightforward. English penny, 12th century. It was curious how it had reached Maine, but not particularly remarkable. Mellgren died in 1978. His entire collection was donated to the Maine State Museum. And that is when everything changed. A photograph of the coin appeared in a bulletin published by the Maine Archaeological Society. It was a tiny, regional publication with almost no circulation outside of Maine, but somehow, by chance or fate, a copy of this bulletin crossed the Atlantic Ocean and landed on the desk of a coin dealer in London who specialized in medieval Scandinavian currency. He looked at the photograph, at the coin that had been confidently identified as 12th century English, and he knew immediately that the identification was wrong. The dealer contacted the museum. That coin was not English, it was Norwegian, minted between 1065 and 1080 AD during the reign of Olaf Kyrre, Olaf the Peaceful. And if the provenance was accurate, if it had really been excavated from a Native American site in Maine, then it was the only pre-Columbian Norse artifact ever discovered in the United States, outside of the confirmed Viking settlements in the far north. The implications were staggering. Had Vikings explored the Maine coast? Had they established settlements that had somehow left no other trace? Or was something else happening, something that would reveal capabilities of indigenous peoples that mainstream archaeology had long underestimated? But before anyone could answer those questions, there was a more basic problem to solve. Was the coin even real? In the world of Viking archaeology in North America, skepticism is not just healthy, it is absolutely necessary. The history of Viking hoaxes runs deep. In the 1890s, a Swedish immigrant in Minnesota claimed to have found the Kensington runestone, a slab carved with Norse inscriptions, supposedly dating to 1362. It became famous. Museums displayed it. Scholars debated it. Most experts now consider it a forgery. In the 1960s, a document called the Vinland Map surfaced, seemingly proving medieval Norse knowledge of North America. It fooled experts at Yale University for years before being exposed as an elaborate fake. And right here in Maine, there had been false alarms before. In 1965, human remains discovered at Passamaquoddy were claimed to be Viking. They were not. They were indigenous. 6 years later, stones covered in what appeared to be runic script turned up at Spirit Pond. Harvard scholars examined them and found mostly gibberish, with a few genuine Norse words scattered through meaningless nonsense. 1957, when Mellgren found the coin, was what one University of Toronto archaeologist called a bumper year for Viking fakes. Multiple forgeries surfaced that same year. The timing alone was suspicious. So the first question that had to be answered was simple. Is this coin genuine? Mellgren himself was an obvious suspect. He was a coin collector. He worked part-time at an auction house. Norwegian pennies from this period were available on the open market in the 1950s. If someone wanted to perpetrate a hoax, obtaining an authentic 11th century coin would not have been difficult. All you would need to do was bury it at an archaeological site, wait a few years for the corrosion to develop, and then conveniently discover it during an excavation. It had been done before. It could be done again. But there were problems with the hoax theory. Problems that would become more obvious as experts examined the evidence. First, Mellgren's behavior did not match someone perpetrating a fraud. He never sought fame or publicity from the discovery. When the coin was misidentified as English, he did not correct the record. He simply donated his entire collection to the museum after his death. If the goal was attention or recognition, his actions made no sense. Second, the coin's condition told a story. In 1979, Kolbjørn Skaare traveled from the University of Oslo to Augusta, Maine. Skaare had published his doctoral thesis on coins and coinage in Viking Age Norway. He was one of the world's foremost experts on medieval Scandinavian currency. He examined the Maine Penny in person. What he found was definitive. The coin was genuine. It had been minted in Norway between 1065 and 1080 AD during the reign of Olaf III, also called Olaf Kyrre, the Peaceful. The wear patterns were consistent with decades or even centuries of circulation after minting. The corrosion was not superficial, it was deep and extensive, following exactly the patterns you would expect from long-term burial in acidic, salt-rich coastal soil. Parts of the coin had deteriorated so badly that very little actual silver remained. What survived was mostly corrosion products, the chemical residue left behind as metal breaks down over hundreds of years. In 2017, another Norwegian numismatist named Svein Gullbeck published a detailed analysis confirming Skaare's findings. The coin was authentic. The corrosion was consistent with centuries of burial, not a few years. Third, what would be the motive? Mellgren gained nothing. He never published about the discovery. He never claimed it proved Vikings were in Maine. He barely paid attention to it at all. And then he died, donating everything to the museum without fanfare. Most experts who have examined the evidence now agree that while the hoax theory is possible, it is unlikely. The coin is almost certain to be a genuine 11th-century Norwegian penny that was really excavated from the Goddard site in 1957, which meant the question remained, how did it get there? The second theory was the one that immediately captured the public imagination. Vikings had sailed to Maine, and on the surface, it wasn't impossible. We know Vikings reached North America. The settlement at Meadows in Newfoundland, discovered in 1960 and excavated over the following decade, proved definitively that Norse explorers had established a base camp around the year 1020. The medieval Icelandic sagas described multiple Norse voyages to lands they called Helluland, Markland, and Vinland, regions identified with Baffin Island, Labrador, and areas farther south where wild grapes grew. The sagas mentioned encounters with indigenous peoples, trade, conflict, violence. Some researchers believe the Norse explored well beyond Newfoundland. Brigida Wallace, a former senior archaeologist at Parks Canada who spent decades studying Meadows, thinks they probably reached as far south as New Brunswick, just across the border from Maine. The distance from Meadows to the Goddard site is only about 500 miles. For experienced Norse sailors who had already crossed the entire North Atlantic Ocean, that distance was entirely manageable. At Meadows itself, archaeologists found butternuts in the Norse deposits. Butternuts do not grow anywhere near Newfoundland. They are native to regions much farther south, around New Brunswick and northern Maine. The Norse were traveling beyond their base camp. They were exploring. They were collecting resources from warmer regions. So Vikings reaching Maine isn't impossible. It's just unproven. In more than 70 years since the Maine Penny was discovered, no other Norse artifacts have been found at the Goddard site. Professional archaeologists conducted extensive excavations for years after Mellgren's initial work. If Vikings had been there, if they had established even a temporary camp or engaged in direct trade with indigenous inhabitants, there should be more evidence. When archaeologists excavated Meadows, they found everything you would expect from a Norse settlement. Iron ship rivets, worked wood, a smithy for producing iron tools, bronze artifacts, stone tools worked in Scandinavian fashion, building foundations that matched architectural patterns from Iceland and Greenland. The Norse presence was undeniable because the physical evidence was overwhelming. At the Goddard site, one coin, 30,000 indigenous artifacts. Everything else recovered from the site was Native American. Stone tools shaped using indigenous techniques. Pottery fragments consistent with local styles. Animal bones from species hunted by native peoples. Fire pits arranged in traditional patterns. Even the single Dorset culture burin, a specialized tool for working caribou antlers, came from far to the north but was clearly indigenous technology, not Norse. The absence of any other Scandinavian artifacts is telling. Vikings did not travel light. Their ships required constant maintenance, which meant iron tools and rivets. They wore distinctive brooches, belt fittings, and jewelry. They processed food with specific kinds of knives. If they had spent any meaningful time at the Goddard site, some trace should remain. The absence speaks plainly. There is nothing, just the coin. Brigida Wallace, who is generally open to Norse exploration beyond Newfoundland, has stated that direct Viking contact with Maine is highly unlikely. The consensus among archaeologists who have studied the evidence is that while a brief Norse visit cannot be absolutely ruled out, there is simply no supporting evidence beyond this single coin. Which brings us to the third theory, the one that fits all the evidence and reveals capabilities mainstream archaeology has consistently underestimated for centuries. The coin did not travel on a Viking ship. It traveled through Native American trade networks. To understand how this works, you need to understand what the Goddard site actually was. This was not a random location. It was a major trade hub. Over the years of excavation, more than 30,000 artifacts were recovered from the site. Radiocarbon dating and stratigraphic analysis showed the site had been occupied primarily between 1180 and 1235 AD, though there was evidence of earlier and later use as well. The coin itself dates to between 1065 and 1080 AD when it was minted, but coins circulated for decades or even centuries after minting. This particular coin shows heavy wear, indicating it was in use for a long time. It could easily have reached the Goddard site during the 1200s, which fits perfectly within the period of most intensive occupation. The people who lived at the Goddard site were ancestors of the modern Penobscot nation. They were part of the Wabanaki Confederacy, a political and cultural alliance of several Algonquian-speaking peoples in what is now Maine and the Canadian Maritimes. These were not isolated communities. They were nodes in extensive trade networks that stretched hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles. We know this because of what else was found at the Goddard site, that Dorset culture burn, for example. The Dorset people lived in the Arctic, primarily around Hudson Bay, Baffin Island, and northern Labrador. Their culture flourished between roughly 500 BC and 1500 AD. For a Dorset tool to end up in Maine means it traveled at least 1,000 miles south, probably through multiple intermediate groups. This was not unusual. Copper artifacts found at sites in the northeastern United States have been traced through chemical analysis to sources in the Great Lakes region, 900 miles to the west. Obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for toolmaking, moved across even greater distances, traveling from sources in Wyoming all the way to Ohio and beyond, covering well over 1,000 miles. Shells from the Gulf of Mexico have been found in burials in the Great Lakes region. Marine shells from the Atlantic coast have been discovered at inland sites in the Midwest. Specific types of stone used for tool making can be traced to quarries hundreds of miles from where finished tools are found. What all of this evidence demonstrates is that indigenous peoples of North America maintained sophisticated, long-distance trade networks long before Europeans arrived. These networks operated on a relay system. Goods did not necessarily travel with a single trader from origin to destination. Instead, they moved from community to community, each group trading with its neighbors, objects passing through many hands over time and distance. A piece of copper mined near Lake Superior might be traded to a group in what is now Michigan. They would work it into an ornament or tool and trade it to a group in Ohio. That group might trade it to another in Pennsylvania, and so on, the object moving gradually eastward through a series of exchanges until it reached the Atlantic coast. This relay system means that exotic objects could travel enormous distances without any single person ever making the entire journey. These were not random, chaotic movements. They followed established routes, seasonal gathering places, and long-standing relationships between groups. The Goddard site sat at a perfect location for trade. It was on Penobscot Bay, accessible by water from multiple directions. The Penobscot River provided access to the interior. The coastal route connected it to other communities along the Atlantic seaboard. Groups traveling by canoe could reach the site easily. Its position near the present-day border between the U.S. and Canada placed it at the junction of multiple regional networks. So, if the Maine Penny arrived through Native American trade networks, what would that journey have looked like? The most likely scenario begins with Norse contact with indigenous peoples somewhere in Atlantic Canada. We know this contact happened. Archaeological evidence from sites in the high Arctic shows that Norse Greenlanders and Thule Inuit encountered each other and likely traded. A study published in Science Advances in September 2024 used ancient DNA from walrus remains to trace the source of ivory traded by Greenlandic Norse. The researchers, led by Hilary Ruiz Puerta, found that much of the walrus ivory exported to Europe came from remote hunting grounds in the high Arctic, areas that were also frequented by Thule Inuit hunters. The genetic evidence proved that Norse and indigenous peoples were operating in the same places at the same times, hunting the same resources. While the study could not definitively prove direct trade between the groups, it showed they were in contact. Other archaeological finds support this. Norse artifacts have been found at indigenous sites in Arctic Canada. Indigenous artifacts have been found at Norse sites in Greenland. At Meadows in Newfoundland, the only confirmed Norse settlement in North America, there is no direct evidence of prolonged contact with local indigenous peoples. The site appears to have been used as a base for further exploration. Those butternuts found at the site do not grow anywhere near Newfoundland. They are native to regions much farther south. The Norse were traveling beyond their base camp. The sagas describe trade between Norse explorers and the indigenous peoples they called Skraelings. The accounts mention exchanges of goods, though they also describe violence and mistrust. What matters for our purposes is that trade happened. Objects moved between Norse and indigenous hands. So here's how the coin might have traveled. Sometime in the 11th or 12th century, Norse explorers based at or near Meadows encountered indigenous people. This could have been the Beothuk, who lived in Newfoundland. It could have been the Mi'kmaq, who occupied regions of the Canadian Maritimes. The encounter might have been peaceful trade. It might have been the Norse buying supplies, or it might have been indigenous people finding the coin at an abandoned Norse camp after the Scandinavians had left. However it happened, the coin entered indigenous possession. From there, it began its journey south. The Mi'kmaq had trading relationships with the Maliseet, whose territory extended along the St. John River in what is now New Brunswick. The Maliseet traded with the Passamaquoddy, whose lands included the coast of Maine near the Canadian border. The Passamaquoddy traded with the Penobscot, whose territory included Penobscot Bay. At each stage, the coin would have been a curiosity. It was made of silver, an exotic metal with strange markings, exactly the kind of foreign object that could be kept and traded again. The journey might have taken decades, it might have taken a century. There is no way to know, but eventually, through this chain of exchanges, the coin reached the Goddard site, where it was either lost, discarded, or deliberately cached with other valuable items. There it lay, buried in the acidic soil, slowly corroding, until Guy Melgren pulled it from the mud 900 years later. This explanation fits all the evidence. It accounts for why the coin is authentic. It explains why it is the only Norse artifact at the site. It is consistent with what we know about indigenous trade networks, which demonstrably moved objects across distances of 500 miles and more, and it is consistent with the archaeological evidence showing that Norse and indigenous peoples were in contact during this period. The Maine State Museum, which has custody of the coin and has studied it extensively, officially states that the most likely explanation for the coin's presence is that it was obtained by indigenous people somewhere near the Norse settlements in Newfoundland. It eventually reached the Goddard site through native trade channels. This isn't the dramatic story of Vikings exploring the Maine coast, but it's a more important story, because what the Maine Penny actually proves has nothing to do with how far south the Vikings traveled. What it proves is that indigenous trade networks in North America were far more sophisticated than European scholars ever acknowledged. For centuries, the assumption was that Native American groups were isolated, with limited contact and only local trade. The archaeological evidence tells a different story. Copper from Lake Superior traveled to New York, marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico reached Ohio, obsidian from Wyoming ended up in the Mississippi Valley, and a Norse coin from Newfoundland made it to Maine. The people who lived at the Goddard site weren't waiting for Europeans to connect them to the wider world. They were already part of one, their world, a network of relationships and exchange routes that spanned half a continent, maintained over generations. Through that chain of trading relationships, a small piece of silver minted in Norway passed from Norse hands to indigenous hands, moving south from group to group until it reached the Goddard site. When Guy Melgren pulled that corroded coin from the mud in 1957, he didn't uncover evidence of Vikings in Maine. He uncovered proof that 500 miles was no obstacle for the indigenous peoples of northeastern North America, that they had the organizational capability to move exotic objects across distances that would have impressed even the Norse seafarers who minted that coin. The establishment got it wrong. Not about how far Vikings sailed, about how capable indigenous societies were. The coin made a journey, but It wasn't a Norse journey, it was an indigenous one, and that's the story that matters. If you enjoyed discovering why Native Americans had trade networks more sophisticated than we imagined, watch the video on screen for more from Lost Evidence.